people involved with the original terror, were now attacked. Inflation continues. Rule by rich bourgeoisie liberals took into place, and more foreign wars took place as well. So it was, in a way, kind of a in-between between the radical left revolution and the original monarchy. So things like churches reopening, that could be viewed as a good thing. People get freedom of religion, that could be a good thing as well. But the continuing rise of inflation, the incredibly wealthy ruling class didn't really fall equal to the aims of Robespierre. So it's kind of a contrast in between the middle. It was definitely a reaction, though, to the radical ways of the revolution. For a time, though, the Directory gave a troubled country a period of order. However, as with all rich, powerful rulers, corruption began. Continued inflation and hunger, as well as the continued cost and threats of foreign wars, led the Directory to lose confidence of the French people. All right, so that leads to a certain general who was very popular in these foreign wars by the name of Napoleon. And he was out there fighting in all these foreign wars. He even went in a campaign to Egypt where he lost. He kept that out of the newspapers. That was his last campaign. He turned home and he seized power. Him and his friends encouraged him to seize a little political power. In November 1799, his troops surrounded the national legislature and drove out most of his members. The remaining members voted to dissolve the Directory. In its place, they established a group of 3 consuls in kind of the Roman form of government. He quickly took the title of first consul, pretty much making him little more than a dictator, and that pretty much gave birth to the French phrase, which you will need to know for the test, coup d'etat, or to blow the state. So at first, Napoleon had a real vote of the people to approve a new constitution. Desperate for strong leadership, the people voted overwhelmingly in favor of the constitution. This gave all the real power to Napoleon as first consul, chief man on top. Yeah, pretty much that's how it went from there on out. Here's a little bit of what it looks like at home. Napoleon kept many of the changes that had come with the revolution by supporting laws that would both strengthen the central government and achieve some of the goals of the revolution. He set up an efficient method of tax collection and established a national banking system that improved the economy. In addition to ensuring the government a steady supply of tax money, these actions promoted pretty much sound financial management, not crazy situations where people were lining up for bread. That was kind of a commonality under Robespierre's reign. He dismissed corrupt officials and set up public tax-free public schools. These lycées were open to all students of all backgrounds, and graduates or successful graduates were appointed to high situations or high places in the government, not just based on family connections. One era, though, where Napoleon disregarded changes introduced by the revolution was religion, and perhaps it was for the better of his people at the time. Both the clergy and many peasants wanted to restore the position of the church, so, responding to their wishes, Napoleon signed an agreement called the Concordat with Pope Pius at the time. So this established a new relationship between church and state. The government recognized the influence of the church, but rejected church control over national affairs, which was a big deal and pretty much unprecedented at the time because the church had its fingers in a lot of affairs throughout Europe and all the way into places like Asia where they were really trying to expand. The church was very powerful at the time, so it was a pretty big deal as well. So Napoleon thought his greatest work, though, was a comprehensive system of laws known as the Napoleonic Code. It gave a country kind of a uniform set of laws. It eliminated many injustices, however, it actually limited liberty, though, and promoted order and authority over individual rights. There was some censorship and freedom of speech and press that was popular during the Revolution was kind of very much restricted under the code, and it also did bring back slavery. In 1804, as I said before, Napoleon made himself emperor, and the French voters did give him a lot of support. On December 2nd, 1804, dressed in a beautiful king-like outfit, Napoleon walked down Notre Dame Cathedral, and was crowned Emperor of France. And so now what he decided to do is create an empire. How he did that was foreign wars. He wanted to reassert French power over the Americas. He envisioned his Western Empire, including Louisiana, Florida, French Guiana, and the French West Indies, so he really worked to restore that. Napoleon decided to take back the colony of what's now known as Haiti, or Saint-Domingue at the time, and he also wanted to conquer Europe after some of those Saint-Domingue or Haiti investigations or expeditions failed. He decided to cut his losses in America, head to Europe, and he ended up doing quite well for a time. He had already annexed the Austrian Netherlands and parts of Italy to France and set up a puppet government in Switzerland. So he pretty much was under control of Switzerland. They were supposed to be very closely allied with him. Now he looked to expand his influence further. Fearful of his ambitions, the British persuaded Russia, Australia, and Sweden to kind of create a coalition to defeat the ever-growing in power Napoleon. He also met this challenge with a series of pretty successful battles. And things were working really pretty well. In his drive for a European empire, Napoleon lost only one major battle, which is the Battle of Trafalgar is how it's pronounced. This naval defeat was more important than all of his victories on land, because the battle took place off the coast of Spain. The British commander, Horatio Nelson, name sound familiar, defeated Napoleon in Egypt. That's if you're wondering. He was brilliant in warfare at sea. He split the larger French fleet in a bold maneuver, capturing many ships. The destruction of the French fleet had two major results. First, it ensured the supremacy of the British Navy for the next 100 years. It's a pretty big deal. And it forced Napoleon to give up his plans of invading Britain. So now he had to look for another way to control England. Unfortunately, Napoleon's extravagant efforts to crush Britain would lead to some mistakes that would be his downfall. During the first decade of the 1800s, Napoleon's victory had given him mastery over most of Europe. By 1812, the only areas of Europe free from Napoleon's control were Britain, Portugal, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire, but the French Empire was relatively unstable at the time. Napoleon was able to maintain it at its greatest extent for only 5 years, and Napoleon, through his bold actions, kind of led to his own undoing. The first was the Continental System. There's the three big mistakes that you really need to remember that led to his own undoing there. So he set up a blockade, the forcible closing of all ports to prevent all trade and communication between Great Britain and other European nations. He intended to destroy Great Britain's commercial and industrial economy. Napoleon's blockade was not very effective. It was aided by the British. Smugglers managed to bring cargo from Britain into Europe, so trade continued, even though there was supposedly a blockade going on. In addition, Britain responded with its own much better blockade because they had the better navy. And also the next mistake was the Peninsular War. In 1808, Napoleon made a second costly mistake in an effort to get Poland to accept the Continental System and the blockade against Britain. He sent an invasion force through Spain, which pretty much, it's not like you're just walking through Spain. It's like when an army comes through Spain, or any other country for that matter, they have to stop, they have to kill the cattle of random peasants, and this is like over 500,000 people coming through, destroying the resources of peasants and people of Spain for what's supposed to be a pretty long time. So as you can imagine, not very many people were in favor of it. And this outraged the Spanish people and inflamed their nationalistic feelings, or at the time kind of just a collection of loose states. This kind of bound them together. And for 6 years, bands of Spanish peasant fighters known as the guerrillas struck at French armies all throughout Spain, as they kind of really didn't listen to Spanish requests not to invade. So the guerrillas were not an army that Napoleon could defeat in open battle. They just struck at little random points, and thousands, 300,000 men lost in the Peninsular War, so called because Spain lies on the Iberian Peninsula. Those losses were bad for the French Empire. Finally was the invasion of Russia. Napoleon's most disastrous mistake came about in 1812. Even though Alexander had become Napoleon's ally, the Russian Tsar refused to stop selling grain to Britain because they needed trade with Britain because they needed materials for when their winter came about and they couldn't really grow anything. So they were enforcing the blockade. So France decided to attack. 420,000 soldiers marched into Russia. As Napoleon advanced, Alexander pulled back his troops, refusing to be lured into a battle Napoleon would win. On this retreat, Russians practiced a scorched earth policy, which they burned everything to the ground. They couldn't eat the livestock that Alexander's army had left behind. They couldn't sleep in their houses. They couldn't camp. Their lives would just be hell as they advanced into Russia. On September 7th, 1812, the two armies finally clashed at the Battle of Borodino. After several hours of indecisive fighting, the Russians fell back, allowing Napoleon to move on to Moscow, which was the capital. Rather than surrender the holy city to the French, Alexander destroyed it. Napoleon stayed in the ruined city until the middle of October. Big mistake when he decided to head back to France. And this is, by the way, in the middle of the winter. Very cold winter. In early November, when the French were freezing, they were tired, they were hungry, Russian raiders attacked Napoleon's ragged retreating army and wiped out 97% of it. Napoleon's armies were quick to take advantage of this weakness. Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden joined forces against him. Austria declared war on Napoleon despite his marriage to Marie-Louise, who was the leader of Austria at that time, or was associated with the top government official at that time. All of the main powers of Europe were now at war with France, and in only a few months, Napoleon managed to raise another army. However, most of his troops weren't really prepared. By January of 1814, the Allied armies were pushing steadily towards Paris. Some 2 months later, King Frederick William III of Prussia and Tsar Alexander led their troops through a triumphant parade of the French capital. Napoleon wanted to keep fighting, but his generals refused, and he was exiled to Elba, a tiny island off the Italian coast. But he wouldn't stay there forever. After Louis XVI's brother assumed the throne as Louis XVII, the king's executed son, Louis XVII, died in prison. This is Louis XVIII, he assumed the throne. As the king's executed son, Louis XVII, died in prison in 1795. King Louis XVI's son died in prison, and King Louis XVI was executed. So King Louis XVIII assumed the throne. And the new king pretty much became unpopular among the subjects, especially the peasants, because, well, he ruled like a king. The news of Louis' troubles was all the incentive Napoleon needed to regain power. He came out of his island exile and landed in France, as joyous crowds welcomed him on the march to Paris. Thousands of volunteers swelled the ranks of his army. Within days, Napoleon was the emperor again of France. He was defeated in Waterloo. As Napoleon was fighting the British army, the Prussian army soon arrived. Together, they easily defeated the French, and Napoleon's exhausted troops gave way, and the British and Prussian forces chased them from the field at Waterloo. The defeat ended Napoleon's last bid for power, called the 100 Days. Taking no chances this time, the British shipped Napoleon to St. Helena, which is a remote island in the middle of the South Atlantic. There he lived very lonely and died of stomach cancer. So yeah, that was a very controversial whirlwind life for Napoleon. Very up and down situation for Napoleon. And the question is, what would happen after here? Because it left a huge power vacuum, because Napoleon was probably more powerful than King Louis XVI ever was. And that led to the Congress of Vienna. This is the last thing I promise. I'm sorry. We've been going on for a long time now. Right. So Napoleon's gone, and it's now time for the 5 now great powers: Prussia, Russia, Australia, Great Austria, Great Britain, and France to decide what was going on. So these 5 great powers made their decisions mostly in secret, but by far the most